So we left off in chapter 24, where the master and Margarita were leaving Boland with the studded horseshoe. So chapter 25 comes around, and now we're actually back in first century Palestine, and the storm is raging after the execution of Yahshua, and Pilate is on the couch drinking, and it's beginning to dawn on him the sheer magnitude of the events that are transpiring. And as the storm dies down, the hooded man Ephraimius, Pilate's henchman, reports to Pilate that the mood of the city is satisfactory, also while stating that only the only absolute power in the world is Caesar. So basically, Pilate kills Yahshua because he wants to keep the mood of the city at a satisfying degree to where an uprising and riots won't start. So, and he's achieved that now, but he doesn't really feel that good about it. Pilate expresses his frustration with Palestine and with Jerusalem, stating that he gets sick when he goes to this province, and how much he hates being here, and how much he hates feasts in particular, because they attract magicians, wizards, and one of whom he considers to be Jesus. In reality, Pilate knows he did wrong by executing Jesus, and this is how he's coping. So he's starting to feel the weight of his mistake. When Pilate asks Ephraimius how the execution went, Ephraimius reports that Jesus gracefully did not blame anybody for his death. One of the last things he heard Jesus say is that amongst the greatest vices of humanity is cowardice. And this report hits Pilate like a hammer, because Yahshua knew that a report would be going back to Pilate about the execution, and he knew that this message would get to him vicariously through Ephraimius. So Pilate feels convicted, and he hates how true this is, and he feels like a coward for doing what he did. So Pilate then orders Ephraimius to bury the bodies in a secret location, and he doesn't want Jesus to get a cult following. He's afraid that people might create a shrine where Yahshua is buried, so he orders that he be buried in a secret location. Plus, this is also a metaphor for how Pilate wants to bury his memories of what he did. So he then explores possibilities of what to do with Judas. Ephraimius says Judas will be paid for his cooperation in the capture and arresting of Yeshua, and Pilate says that Judas will be assassinated by a secret friend of Yeshua that night, and he considers the cursed money. He considers the money that Judas will be paid with to be cursed money, and it should be returned to the temple. So Pilate plans to, now he doesn't say this at the time, but he basically plans to assassinate Judas himself as a way of atoning for his sin of crucifying Yeshua, a good man, out of cowardice. So Ephraimius says it will be a difficult task because it might cause scandal, but Pilate is confident that it will happen because he's planning on doing it without telling anybody. So then chapter 26 rolls around. We're still in first century Palestine with Pilate, whose headache is actually returning. He feels like he's permanently lost something very valuable. Bulgakov also mentions in this chapter that Pilate whistles to his dog, and his dog comes running. And this is actually a symbol of loyalty, and loyalty is the opposite of cowardice. And this is actually, Bulgakov is symbolizing this in Pilate's dog, which comes back in later chapters, illustrating the same point. So Pilate is then starting to feel more loyalty and moral obligation to Yahshua, more so in death than in life. So Ephraimius has gone to the barracks in order to order his men to bury the bodies. After that, he visits a girl named Nisa who has a brief conversation with him, and the reader doesn't actually know what they say or what the contents of that conversation is, but it is hinting that the two are having an affair, for whatever relevance that holds, given that Nisa says that her husband's away. So after Judas gets his 30 pieces of silver from Caiaphas, he goes to the market where he, quote, coincidentally runs into Nisa, who persuades him to follow her. She has him meet her at the olive grove, or the grotto, which is basically Gethsemane, where he backstabbed Jesus, only to get jumped and stabbed in the back by assassins himself. So Judas is now dead. So back at the palace, Pilate is having a hard time sleeping later that night. So he moves his bed out into the moonlight and takes his cloak off and places his dagger on his cloak. He falls asleep and he has a dream where he meets Yeshua. And they converse and debate many things, but the main topic is cowardice. And Pilate's subconscious is correcting his stubbornness, and he admits that it was cowardly and awful and unjust for him to kill Yeshua, who is he considers to be a good man. After understanding this, Pilate repents and tells Yeshua that he will sacrifice his career to bring him back, and Yeshua forgives him, and Pilate asks Yeshua to remember him. So very similar to the way the thief on the cross asked Christ to remember him. So now he is awoken by one of his men informing him that Aphronius has come with news, and Aphronius reports that Yeshua has been, or that not Yeshua, but Judas has been killed, and his evidence is a bloody purse containing the silver. But he didn't find Judas's body. So the two converse about how to navigate the situation discreetly, given that none of the Sanhedrin will admit to paying Judas. Pilate suggests that it might have been a suicide, and then this rumor begins to circulate throughout the city. So when Pilate asks Aphronius how the burial went, Aphronius reports they had to track down Matthew Levi in a cave, who stole the body and was very devoted to Yeshua. They let him help bury the body as a form of consolation. So Pilate is moved by Matthew's compassion and dedication to Yeshua that he demands to have an audience with him. So when Matthew Levi meets Pilate, he refuses to sit down in a chair on the floor because he's dirty, but also this kind of signifies his rebellion in a way, that he doesn't want to sit at the table with Pilate. He holds Pilate in contempt because he holds him responsible for killing Yeshua. So Pilate offers Levi some good work, a position at a library. He offers him money as an attempt to compensate and atone for his guilt, but Matthew Levi refuses all of these things, thus setting himself apart from this current society. And also this would set him apart from Soviet society because he's not greedy and materialistic. He then expresses to Pilate that he will devote his life to killing his master's betrayer, Judas, but Pilate then tells him that Judas is already dead and that he's the one who killed him. So this is where we find out formally that Pilate is the one who killed Judas. So chapter 27. These chapters are kind of like a way of wrapping up the story. These are like the final adventures, so to speak, of Behemoth and Koroviev. So we're back in 1930s Moscow, where Margarita is finishing reading the book, that is to say the master's novel. The authorities continue to investigate and depose witnesses regarding the crazy events that have happened for the last few days. Every time investigators go to the apartment where the demons are staying, they're always vacant. the investigators are being portrayed in a kind of a comical way, given that the top staff of the theater has all gone missing and they really can't do anything about it. So Bulgakov is satirizing them in these chapters again. So the investigators then go to the psych ward, where they interview Ivan, who is no longer interested in catching Voland or avenging Berlioz. He seems to be living in another world at this point. Some say he's almost like stupefied, but he's actually very deep in thought. He no longer wants to write poetry. He is only interested in the pilot narrative that he was talking about in chapter 1. When the investigators interview the other victims, like Stiopa, they do what they've always done, which is come up with naturalistic explanations for everything, mostly explaining everything away through hypnosis. The same explanation is used for the theater master during the Black Magic show in chapter 12. He was saying this is all just hypnosis, this isn't actually real. Also, the woman who ran Berlioz over and decapitated him with a tram, she was in some of the last few chapters, and if you remember, she was given a horseshoe with these diamond studs, and then Koroviev basically bought it off her and gave her rubles for it. And those rubles ended up turning into foreign currency, hence getting her arrested. So they're still causing mischief. The demons are basically toying with the authorities. When they come to the apartment with the demons present there, the authorities try to capture Behemoth in a net with no success, and a firefight breaks out and between Behemoth and the authorities, but no one actually gets hurt, which is miraculous considering that they were in a firefight and they were shooting guns at each other, and Behemoth is swinging from a chandelier firing guns at the cops, and they're trying to shoot him and capture him, and it's not working. So the whole scene is rather comical. After the fun, Behemoth then burns down the apartment. Chapter 28. In this chapter, Koroviev and Behemoth start causing trouble at a local store. They put on another spectacle before burning down the store and teleporting to the Moscow headquarters. They are waited on by a waitress. Now, this is the same social club that all of the luxurious extravagance was happening at earlier in the book. So they're back there now, and they're waited on by a waitress, and she asks them for their ID, and they ask her, would you ask Dostoevsky for his ID? And they argue that writers are not known by their ID cards, but rather by their work, which is true, but they're kind of leveraging this truth to be mischievous. So they're basically acting like trolls at this point. They're just trolling this waitress. And the authorities then find them there, and another firefight breaks out again, and Behemoth and Koroviev light the place on fire, and they disappear. So chapter 29, we are back with Azazelo and Voland. Matthew Levi actually appears to them, and the two do not like each other. That is Voland and Matthew Levi. They have a very brief yet very important argument over the nature of good and evil. Matthew Levi wishes Voland no good in his existence, but Voland says that all things cast shadows, meaning that evil can't be ignored because in this fallen world, good and evil play off each other, and they are codependent to a certain extent, and that's Voland's argument. However, Matthew Levi gets to sorry, I misspelled my own notes. Matthew Levi gets to serve Yeshua for all eternity, separating his narrative from Voland's. So then Levi states that Yeshua has read the Master's work and demands that Voland give him peace. So Volan tells Azazel to summon the Master and Margarita, and we can get further into this chapter in the discussion then, because there's a lot of rich themes in there. So the couple are conversing. Some highlights are that the Master believes they are both mentally ill, and she doesn't mind that. She says it's fine, we can handle it together. Also, she seems to have a lot of trust in Volan to fix everything based on her experiences with him before. So Azazel shows up and gives them a bottle of wine that Pontius Pilate drank from. When they drink it, it kills them, but they are later revived in soul. The reason for this is that they must die in their earthly bodies before they can have peace that Yahshua demanded Volan give them. So now they're on their way to see him. They stop at the clinic to see Ivan Nikolaevich, homeless, and the Master tells him to write the sequel to the pilot novel. This marks the end of Ivan's character arc. He is very much in touch with the supernatural and has denounced his atheism, along with his old way of life. He now has devoted his life to authentic art and true writing, free from the bonds of the society he once served so zealously. So then chapter 31, now a storm ensues. During the last chapter has come to a close, and there's a rainbow over the city. Basically, like, kind of playing off Volan's argument in one of the previous chapters. Good and evil kind of play off each other, and you can't get the rainbow without the storm. Now, Behemoth and Koroviev have a little bit of fun for one last time, where they're whistling and singing and causing buildings to fall over and causing trees to uproot themselves. Chapter 32 rolls around, and this is the last chapter. As the couples are soaring through the air on these black horses, the true appearance of the demons is revealed. Koroviev is seen as a violet knight who is basically just expressionless. Behemoth is revealed to be a jester. Azazel, of course, is revealed to be Azazel, the desert demons that the Israelites would release their sin goats to in, I believe it was Leviticus 11. Volan tells the Master that his novel has been read, and Pilate has been in torment on the balcony for the last 2,000 years, and it's up to the Master to free him. And in this novel, and this is showing that true art has true consequences in the real world, both good and bad. So Bulgakov is making a very interesting link there. Volan explains that Pilate has been in torment in the moonlight, thus making the moon kind of like an inverted symbol of peace, but also traditionally the moon has also been considered a symbol of madness, like at least the full moon, that is to say. He is tormented by the desire to walk a moonlit path with Yahshua, but is never able to actually do so because of his sin. So the Master then frees Pilate of his guilt by shouting that Yahshua is waiting for him, and Pilate now gets to finish his conversation with Yahshua. With a few parting words, the devil and his entourage actually vanish, and the Master and Margarita walk to their eternal home in peace. Their humble requirements are simple, and it is to reject a materialistic existence, and they live happily ever after. And then there's an epilogue after that, which the basic gist of that I was able to gather is that after all the demons leave Moscow, Moscow basically continues on as it always has. And the authorities are continuing to come up with naturalistic explanations for all the demonic activity that had taken place there over the last couple of days. So that's basically the end of the book. So we'll start with chapter 25. Any thoughts?
Was that the one with Pilate, or 25 was...
Yeah, we go back to first century Palestine, and, yeah.
So, obviously, it's very interesting because Pilate takes all this guilt on, and he's... we know a little bit later that he actually, takes... he takes it upon himself to, seek justice for Yahshua's execution. And he takes it out on Judas, obviously. But I think it's really interesting here because Bulgakov's been trying to do this the whole novel, is draw this comparison between Pilate and kind of the Soviet state and he's doing, Pilate has secret police, kind of he has a secret legion that does his will behind the scenes. And I think actually that scene where what's his name, the name of the head of the secret police,
Aphanius, yeah.
He goes to see Nisa. I think they're actually arranging the death of Judas.
Yeah.
And Aphanius then later in the chapter when he's telling Pilate about it, they both know what happened, but he's just stating for the record, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We don't know. We know where, I'm pretty sure I know where I'm going to find his body. They know all the details, but they need to fill out the official reports, so I think that's kind of interesting.
That's a good observation right there. That's a good catch, because it's if it's, it's that disjointed view of reality where it's okay, we planned this, we know exactly what happened, we're the ones who did it, but...
And as far as they know, no one else is in the room, but they're still discussing it as if it's this secret,
Yeah.
As if they're going about official business, neither one of them knows what's going on.
Right.
But the reality is, I'm pretty sure both of them know. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's, like I said, Bulgakov's been kind of trying to draw that comparison. I think that's very Soviet, the stuff going on behind the scenes, but then trying to make it look official for the media and all of the propaganda that they put out.
Yeah.
That's very communist agenda.
Yeah, that's true. It's almost yeah, there's two different worlds, but only one of them matters, which is the one that's on paper.
And it's interesting too because obviously he brings up the message of cowardice, because ultimately Pilate is the one who sanctions the execution, right? He could go against it, but it might cause a little bit of uproar, which he's trying to avoid. So he executes him anyways. And instead of looking inward, he pins it on Judas, because Judas is the one that turned him in. He's if you didn't turn him in, I wouldn't have had to kill him.
Yeah.
That kind of line of reasoning, which is obviously flawed.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is how we're kind of seeing his subconscious sort of calling him out on this, because his way of atoning for that, because he knows that Judas backstabbed him by baiting him into being arrested. So Pontius Pilate's whole thing is okay, well, if I just kill this guy, to avenge Yahshua, then that'll be a way of me atoning for the wrong I've done. but of course, then he has that vision and realizes that killing Judas was almost like irrelevant. It's a very, but it makes sense that his line of reasoning would go there though, because he's kind of a law and order kind of guy. So he's like, okay, well, I ended up killing this guy because he backstabbed him. So if I just kill him, that'll make me feel better. But of course, it doesn't actually work.
Right.
Because Matthew Levi wanted to kill him. Which is also kind of interesting too, which is also like a major subversion of the gospel, because the actual gospel stories, the apostles did not care about Judas at all after Christ was crucified. But in this case, like Matthew Levi, I guess Bulgakov is trying to show this theme of both cowardice and devotion. Again, cowardice equals betrayal, devotion equals loyalty and virtue. And Matthew Levi going to kill Judas was almost like Bulgakov is not condemning the idea of atoning for something by killing somebody else initially. But then once Pilate kind of has that vision of Christ, it's like all of that kind of melts away. It's a very interesting setup.
Right. And we see later, though, too, that, Pilate is basically tortured. Like, he's basically locked in this state of, perpetual, torment, because he just wants to walk the path and talk to Yahshua, and he can't. Where, on the other hand, Matthew Levi is... it's not really described perfectly well, but he's able to still serve Yahshua.
Yeah, even in death. Even though he's dead, he still serves him.
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting because Bulgakov did not mention anything about the resurrection.
Right.
Not a peep.
Well, again, I think it kind of goes back to, and this is tough because, on one hand, it's we're hearing the account of supposedly the devil. Mm-hmm. So it's how much can you actually put into that account?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to say in this story, because in that account, it tries to make Yahshua look just like a regular man, even just a regular man who didn't even want that kind of attention.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in the end, Matthew Levi is still serving Yahshua and in another, state of existence. So it is, showing that he was Christ. Mm-hmm. And that Matthew is his disciple, and he's, sending him in his stead to talk to Volan. And they have this, discourse where they're, at odds.
Mm-hmm. I really do think it was a very, very good safety net that Bulgakov employed when he put that Faust quote before the entire book. Because the whole Faust quote is centered around the idea that good things can even come out of evil things. Of course, the biblical example is Genesis 50. Mm-hmm. When Joseph tells his brothers, you intended evil, but God used it for good. And I think that can really help temper some of the situations that we see in this book, where even though the devil is kind of, he's twisting things, there's still certain kinds of good that are coming out of it. Mm-hmm. Like this loyalty and all of this stuff. And when I was looking into some things that other people thought about this story, is they were saying Voland isn't completely bad. He's kind of a gray character, but it's no, he's the devil. He is totally bad. It's just, even though he's trying to work his will ultimately isn't going to overcome God's will. That's kind of what I got out of that in that regard.
That, and we were talking a little bit before about how ultimately he's still subservient to God. Like, he can't, like Yahshua sends Matthew, Levi with his like request, and the devil can't refuse it.
Yeah.
He can't. He has to grant the master peace, and like it seems like Volan can't say no, like because he was asked, he has to give it. So it's almost like he is the shadow that exists within all the light. He's like that little shadow that's cast, and it's like he's always going to exist because where there's light, there's shadows. I think that's kind of like part of the point of what they were trying to talk about there.
Yeah, I mean there is this one element in Christian and Hebrew theology, for that matter, known as like the left hand of God, where God will allow chaos where chaos will best serve people. And that's what Voland is in this story. Basically just an agent of chaos with his entire entourage. But yeah, it's interesting that even if you want to take an Aryan reading of this portrayal of Christ, because I was thinking about this, like whenever Christ is portrayed, he never claims to be God, he never claims his divinity. If anything, they kind of downplay that, especially in the second chapter. But given where things end up, it's almost like Voland has to obey Yahshua. He has to obey Jesus. That almost is kind of saying like, okay, well, this isn't just a man then, because we've seen what Voland does with regular men. He just plays with them, but he can't do that with Yahshua.
Right.
So I found that to be another interesting point. What did you make of the dream where Pilate meets Yahshua?
Where they're talking about the cowardice and stuff?
Yeah, like where Pilate, like after he kills Judas, he goes to sleep, and then when he falls asleep, he has that mystical experience.
To be honest, I didn't take too many notes at that specific section, so...
Well, I thought it was interesting because basically Yahshua forgives him for killing him.
Oh, yeah.
And and then Pilate is almost like grieving, basically, like he's like sobbing in his sleep, and then that's when he's kind of abruptly woken by Ephraimius, and then he has that conversation with Matthew Levi later, where Matthew Levi is like, hey, by my life, I swear I will kill this Judas guy, and Pilate's like, hey, I already did it. But yeah, those chapters were interesting, the ones in first century Palestine there. Yeah, did you have any other thoughts on chapter 26, which is like our last chapter in Palestine in the entire book?
Not much more than what we already kind of talked about.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to really pinpoint specific things because...
I mean, obviously you can point out all the differences in the gospel, but those are in all of the Palestine sections.
Yeah.
So it's like, those are like plenty.
Yeah.
But I think like ultimately the culmination of all that, like when we see Matthew Levi talk to Volan, and when we see the ultimate fate of Pontius Pilate, when they finally come up to him, I think those scenes are the most important things.
Yeah. Of course, the very next chapter, then we're back in Russia, where Koroviev and Behemoth start a gunfight, or at least Behemoth does. So I thought that was kind of amusing. I mean, I think this chapter kind of falls in line in that category of, the mayhem chapters that we've seen beforehand. Which is kind of insane. Like, about at least a third of this book has just been chaos. Like, just the demons running around causing trouble.
Well, at the start of chapter 27, there's an interesting comment about Margarita's soul being in perfect order. Mm-hmm. This is, like, the day after, all of the ball and all of the previous events. And I just thought that comment was interesting because she just basically signed a pact with the devil, and it's like, oh, her soul's in perfect order.
I know, it's so strange. Like, I wish I knew more about what Bulgakov was trying to get at with that, because Margarita's character arc is very unorthodox in a way, like, just narratively speaking. Because usually someone makes a deal with the devil and they get screwed over. But it seems like she kind of got everything she wants, but the way things work out for her is like she sells her soul to the devil to ultimately get the master back. Like, she didn't, like, if it weren't for him, she wouldn't have signed a deal with anybody. She wouldn't have become a witch or hosted Satan's ball or anything. But then, whenever she is reunited with the master, the whole, like, this novel about Pontius Pilate, it turns out to play an extremely important role in the story at the end, because with the master setting Pontius Pilate free in his narrative, he then gets to go where he wants with Margarita. So even though Margarita kind of signs a deal with the devil, through the redemption of Pontius Pilate, it's almost like they're released from it. And she almost gets to be released from her pact with the devil just by virtue of being united with the master. Almost like it's like.
Well, it did draw a direct comparison. It's like, this is kind of crude, but it was like talking about Pilate's dog.
Yeah.
And like how the dog was there with him because of him.
Yeah.
Not because of what the dog did. Mm-hmm. It was like.
Yeah.
And yeah. It was a weird thing because Margarita is really the action taker in all this stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, she's the one doing all the stuff and going and dealing with Volan and serving Volan and all that. But like, ultimately, it's the master's work that winds up being the pivotal piece of everything. Mm-hmm. You know, and even after all those events, like, and them being put together in their old basement apartment, like, he still is like having questions about it. He's like, I don't know if that, like, maybe I was just hallucinating. And she's totally on board with everything. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, that is one thing I found a little bit concerning about her character, is she's just like, oh, we're all good, Voland will take care of everything. And it's kind of like, you know, he's the devil. You were just a hostess for his ball. And like, what's interesting is, like, she does have like good things about her, like the way she freed Freda from her sin, and now the way Master is helping to free Pontius Pilate from his. But yet these things, it's like, like at the end of the book, the way they're able to almost like escape the devil is so interesting. And the only reason it seems like they were able to do that is because Yahshua told the devil, you got to give the master peace. And of course, since Margarita is attached to the master, she reaps those same benefits, even though she may have done, like, one could say that she did a lot to merit them by being the devil's servant. There's a lot of ways to look at this. I mean, one thing that crossed my mind is, you know, the old trope of how, you know, like, the way out is in. The most orthodox example of that is the harrowing of Hades, where Christ brings life into the realm of death and thus destroyed death. I would hesitate to make that comparison here, but in a very real way, Margarita did enter into a deal with the demonic, and eventually escaped it. Although she didn't make a deal with the demonic to destroy them, she just did it to get back with the master. But by virtue of what he did, they were able to almost like exit that that exchange. So
Yeah.
perhaps I'm reading too much into it. I'm not exactly sure what Bulgakov was trying to do.
Well, it's tough too because we also know that Bulgakov like writes himself in a way. Like
Yeah.
he's writing himself as the master. We know that he's writing his love as Margarita, and so it's like I almost think he like bends the rules a bit to like give him a good ending, even though they probably shouldn't have a good ending. But just because he's like wrote himself in, like he doesn't want to give himself a bad ending. Like,
Yeah.
I think like the ending could be one of the weakest parts of the novel. Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of like interesting stuff to discuss, but like in terms of like the overall story, I think it's like even by the rules the novel establishes, like it doesn't seem like it follows almost.
Yeah, I mean, things are very surreal and kind of chaotic. Like the last couple of chapters are just totally noetic. Like they're basically not even on Earth anymore. So like all these wild rules are being bent, and like they both die.
Yeah.
Like they become like disembodied souls, and that's how they live happily ever after. I mean, one could criticize Bulgakov of Gnosticism or whatever, which is very much part of the theosophical movement, but
I mean, we can talk more about Bulgakov, like in general, now that the book is done.
yeah.
Because something I think it was a video I watched or something about his life. It was saying basically that, by the end of his life, like you talked a little bit in the first class about how he had these dreams, these visions of the snake coming to him. Like Bulgakov, from what this video said, actually believed that like the devil was trying to communicate with him, and that what the devil was basically passing along his story, and so he was writing down like the Palestine portion of this, like originally was its own thing, and I think that basically what he did in order to publish that was to place it in the form of another book. So in order to publish that account, he like split it up into sections and then wrote the Master and Margarita sections around it to like package it, so to speak, so that it could actually get published. At least that's what the video I watched was trying to postulate. And I actually kind of think that's kind of true, given the way that he paints Volan. Like, he paints him in a light that makes him a lot more favorable than what we would typically see the devil or even just a demonic character, And I think that's because Bulgakov actually thought like he had some kind of communication with him. Which we can talk about that plenty, because that could be, pre-list or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, it could literally just be like, but that goes back to the same point of like, if the devil did communicate with you, would you believe anything he said? Because I wouldn't. He's the great deceiver.
Yeah, I know.
Why would you? Like, it's kind of an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, what do you think about the concept, though, of Volan being a symbolic representative of Stalin?
I think that may have been true in the beginning, but it's also well known that by the end of Bulgakov's life, he felt like he also had a personal connection with Stalin.
Yeah.
Like, when he was dying or whatever, I guess he wanted to make sure that Stalin read his book, even though he was dying. So I think he did have a hatred for Stalin, especially in the beginning, and like everything that Stalin stood for, like not creating the Soviet Union, but creating the state of the Soviet Union that existed. I think he hated all that. But as he got older and whatnot, I think he kind of fell into this fallacy that like he could work within the system, and yeah. So I think Bulgakov ultimately was just like a tortured man who I don't even know if like he wrote the master as himself, but I don't think he is as much like the master as he thinks. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, given the character of Olin and how he's kind of morally gray and he does awful things, like, causes all kinds of mayhem and he backstabs people and gaslights people and all this. But at the same time, though, like, sometimes he'll do something kind of cool once in a while. Like, he'll kind of expose people and deal out some degree of justice. But I don't really consider that to be redemptive, because Stalin also did some nice things for people as well, namely Bulgakov, but he did it to further his own ends. So when a whole bunch of writers got fired and disappeared from public record, and then he decided to give Bulgakov that special position as a director at the theater, he basically used Bulgakov to show, like, hey guys, like, I favor this writer and I can protect him, so I'm not all bad. I'm not anti-art, you know, he's one of the best we have, and I'm giving him this very prestigious position at the local theater. So, and I do actually appreciate Bulgakov making the devil that way, because, you know, devil's tricky. He'll do good, he'll do seemingly nice things. But, you know, in the end, you know, people get backstabbed. Now, what confused me the most, at least at first, was towards the end, I thought to myself, okay, like, the devil is going to screw these two over. He is going to backstab them, because that's what he always does. He is the great deceiver, as you said. So, it's only a matter of time. Like, this contract that they've entered into is a time bomb. But it never really blows up in their face. And the only reason it doesn't is because Joshua himself says to Voland, you have to give the master peace. And then, you know, him and the entourage vanishes, and then the master and Margarita live happily ever after as disembodied souls.
But we still don't know what that means. Like, that was the tricky part for me. It's like, I mean, like, what does that even mean in this context, right? Because,
well, it means
like,
they're not with the devil, which...
Yeah, but if they're also not with Christ, then is that really something worth...
Well, there is the journey of the soul after death, but I honestly don't think Bulgakov even thought that far.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's meant to be very ambiguous, and you're supposed to think about it, and I don't even know if he would say for sure what happened to him, but...
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I thought was interesting, and I've actually never seen anybody else do this, but how he intertwines art with real-life consequences, and not just real-life consequences, but basically eternal consequences. Like, Pontius Pilate was living in torment for 2,000 years, and then somehow Bulgakov sets him free with his own novel. So, did you have any thoughts on that?
About the art part, I mean, it is interesting. Like, I forget which chapter this is, but I think it's like 28 or 29. The last adventures of Goroviev and Behemoth, like, where they go to, like, the Griviatov, the house of the writers and stuff.
Yep.
And they are very interested in writing, or like, and writers specifically. They're like talking about, like, oh, the people in here could be the next whatever. Like, they're naming all these famous authors and books that were written, and then they mention Dostoevsky in that chapter about how he's immortal, but, like, you know, so it's clear that Bulgakov was trying to, like, elevate writers, but also I think that he was very proud to be a writer because he knew that, you know, even beyond death, like writing lives on. Like these things, they kind of are immortal in a way. Like the ideas and the themes and stuff that come from literature. But I have no clue why that would be redemptive for someone else. You know, like why is it that the Master's book about Pilate set Pilate free?
Well, here's what I'm thinking. So Pilate has gained a reputation amongst humankind for what he did in history. He's an essential component of the story of the biggest religion in the world. And one could only wonder, like, because, we typically read the biblical account of Pilate and then we don't really consider what happened to him afterwards. Because we don't really, as far as I understand, we don't really have a whole lot that says what happened to him afterwards. I have heard... Actually, no, never mind. That's Quo Vadis. I was going to say I heard that, like, Claudia, his wife, kind of preached the gospel to him later, and they both became Christians. That might be true. Might not be true. I don't know for sure. Maybe someone who hears this could correct me or clue me in. But basically, I think what Bulgakov is getting at is the consequences of art and stories and everything is it shapes humanity's perception of something. So, if we just look at the gospel accounts of Pilate, he executed Christ, and then that's it. We don't really hear much about him afterwards. Like, what I find interesting is in this story, Yeshua appears before Pontius Pilate and kind of reconciles with him. And it's also said that Christ doesn't blame anybody for his death. But of course, that's not recorded in the Gospels. Whereas in the Gospels in this book, he does appear before Pontius Pilate and reconciles. But that is not, this book isn't, like, in the book, this book isn't published because of Soviet censorship, and which is, which is enforced by a whole bunch of cowards at the Writing Society. And which coincides with the reason that Pontius Pilate killed Christ. So I think he's drawing a lot of these connections together. And then when he finishes his book and he writes about the reconciliation of Pontius Pilate with Yeshua, then that information is now out there. And it can kind of undo, or at least change the course of public perception of Pilate. Now that
I get that. I just mean, like,
yeah,
that's a very interesting view of salvation. To be like, it almost depends on the public view of the person as to what they're saying. Like,
well,
I think if Pilate was, reconciled, like if he were reconciled by Christ, then that's all.
Yeah, then who cares if the public knows?
Then why would he be tormented for 2,000 years?
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting thing, and I'm not sure if Bulgakov really thought that through a ton.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things he didn't quite think through, but
like, I don't mind that, like you could take that stance because about Pilate getting reconciled, because I think Pilate was just the guy in the seat at the time, right? Like any Roman magistrate or whatever who was in that position probably would have come to the same conclusion. So I don't think, I don't think that necessarily Pilate is to be absolutely condemned just on that. Like, you have to also take into account what happened after, which we don't really know. And like you said, if they did ultimately one day convert to Christianity, then that's a huge thing. It's a huge plus.
Yeah.
But, like, I don't know. I guess there's just not a lot known about, like you said, Pilate after Christ's crucifixion, so it's hard to say what exactly happened.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure the tradition of the church does say that Claudia, his wife, had a vision. Well, granted, I heard that from Catholics, but you just do a quick search here.
Like kind of like in this book, you know, in the actual gospel accounts, like Judas, like what Judas does is way worse than what Pilate does. You know, turning on Christ and, you know, basically putting everything in motion.
Yeah. According to an article in History Today, it says not only was Pontius Pilate a Christian, he was also a confessor and martyr. One Eastern text, the handing over of Pilate, has Tiberius ordering the governor to be beheaded for having allowed the crucifixion to go ahead. Now that's interesting. I don't know if I want to get too much into that, but that's the first search result that came up. So whether it's credible or not, who knows? I have to look into it further. But point being, yeah, I mean, given that Pilate, of all people, was, I think that Pilate and the redemption of Pilate is kind of what Bulgakov wanted for everybody that was in the Writer Society, because Pilate crucifies somebody out of cowardice, and he wants to see that cowardice be exterminated from that person, and in that act have that person be redeemed. This is why I thought it was interesting how he basically has Yahshua saying the worst vice of humanity is cowardice.
I actually think that was a bit of a like I think he was talking about himself a little bit there too.
I think you're right.
I mean, I think at large, he was talking about Soviet society and how, you know, people in society in that time were kind of cowards because they wouldn't stand up against all these awful things happening under the Stalin regime. But like, he's also kind of speaking about himself because, like you said, there was times where Stalin would like elevate him and like put him in a position, and when he was in those positions, he didn't do any, like he didn't use that in a good way. Like he didn't push back. He actually, it's well known that he was like, he would go through these swoons like with his second wife, who was there when he got super famous for a little while. And that's when he met his third wife, was because he was super famous and he was going to all these parties and taking advantage of the fact that he was a celebrity now. He was like partying with all the other celebrities and like living it up because he could. So it was almost like when he was getting kicked while he was down, he had all these criticisms of the regime, and then when he got elevated by the regime, he was like just like everybody else. Like he just was one of the crowd. Like he didn't use that elevation to fight back against the thing he hated.
Yeah, when he was in a position of power, he didn't use that power to fight the thing that put him there. Yeah, that's very true. I mean, you know, it really does seem like this is a book written by a guy who hates himself.
Well, we know he was on the brink of suicide
Yep.
at least once in his life.
And he also hated himself for leaving his first wife.
That's an interesting thought.
Yeah.
I mean, he, in a lot of ways, like, he really kind of messed up there because, like, his first wife did so much for him, you know? He's just he's such an interesting character, and, like, I feel like no one else could have written a book like this other than a guy like that. Because this book, like, almost somehow perfectly encapsulates him.
Yeah. I really do feel like him and Oscar Wilde would have been good buddies. because like they're both brilliant in their own crazy ways, but at the same time, like they're both really like kind of twisted up in their own crazy ways. Because I always draw the comparison between this book and the Picture of Dorian Gray. This Picture of Dorian Gray is like deeply profound, but when you look at the life of the man who wrote it, you're like, whoa, like how on earth did a guy like that, how was he tuned in enough to write something like this? And with Bulgakov, like his understanding of demonology, the way demons like infect the overall psychology of a society at a systemic level, the way they infect economics, like I think he had a lot of that down pat in this book. I really do. It's just, I think the ending kind of clues us into like, okay, like what is his real idea of redemption here? Like, how does this even look? Like, how does this even, like if you ask Bulgakov, you sat down with him and says, okay, what is redemption? Because that's kind of supposed to be the ending of this book, which is redemption. And like, you can kind of see some vague ideas of redemption that involve kind of like repentance and forgiveness and all that stuff, but the way in which it comes about is like almost through this deal with the devil. And that's why I said at the beginning, I think it's so good that he put that Faust quote like right in the beginning of the book as almost like a lens to read the book through, because if you don't read it through that lens, it's going to come off as even crazier. It's going to come off as like, well, you almost have to enter into a deal with the devil to have your soul saved. But, I mean, when you filter it through the lens of like, okay, God wills good even through evil at times, then that can kind of help to make some more sense of things. But even then, I mean, there's still things that I don't fully understand about this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like what you were saying about how he has certain things spot on and other things are really seem to be far off or like shaky, like you can't really say for sure. Like we know that he was raised Orthodox up to like a certain age and then he lost his faith. And I think by the time he died, he was spiritual again, but I don't think he was Orthodox.
Right. I mean, we know that he was.
We
know he was very influenced by the Theosophical movement, which is really basically just Gnostic, just New Age Gnosticism.
So I think, like at the base layer, when he's talking about all these things, he has like that Orthodox understanding. But I think some of his extrapolations are like going down the wrong path. If that makes sense.
I think it does make sense.
And I think that's part of why we have a hard time following it. And I don't think that this is like, it's interesting to talk about and all that stuff, but I think, like, I don't know if you're ready to wrap it up or if you want to go over more.
Yeah, we can keep going.
Okay.
I don't care.
I'm just saying, I was going to say, like, I don't think this book ultimately is like, should be read for the religious or the spiritual context. Like, I see that almost as like a backdrop. Like, it's a very entertaining novel.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's very comedic and there's a bunch of interesting things going on, but I wouldn't like read too much into all of the spiritual stuff they're talking about. Mm-hmm. Because I think ultimately it's like, it's coming from the place of a man who's like very fractured, like his spirituality. Mm-hmm. Like he's almost like reaching in a lot of ways for these ideas. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the real, like the strongest points of this book, and like I spoke with Father Borean about this, and like because he says like the most profound thing about this book is the Antichrist figure, and I'm inclined to agree with him there. Like I said before, I think the demonology is very good, and also I honestly think what Bulgakov was really trying to do is just expose how hypocritical and deeply self-contradictory the Soviet Union is, and also just that Marxist ideology in general. And then he goes a step further, but it's not just like a political commentary, because that would be boring. He goes a step further and says, no, this stuff isn't just economically and politically dysfunctional. It's just straight up demonic. Like the imagery of the empty suit doing paperwork, and the imagery of the workers just kind of mindlessly walking around singing patriotic Soviet anthems out of like basically demon possession, and how like it's enough to drive somebody crazy and put them in the psych ward. I think that like if he's critiquing like that specific society in that slice of history, I think it's a brilliant critique if we look at it in that light.
Oh yeah.
But in terms of like what I found interesting is how, I think we mentioned this before, like on the way here, is how like you don't even meet the main characters until you're like halfway through the book. Like we don't even meet the master until we're a third of the way through. We don't meet Margarita until we're like 2/3 the way through, or at least over half the way through. I wonder if it's like, and like I'm such an amateur when it comes to critiquing literature, and like I wouldn't want to put myself in a position where I can critique classic literature, but I really do wonder why he chose to do that, as opposed to like starting with our characters, because it doesn't seem like a character-driven novel. It seems more like a narrative-driven novel, where the characters for the first couple of chapters are paragons, like they exemplify something, and then we don't even really get a real in-depth look at a person until chapter 13, when we meet the master and he tells his story and he talks about what motivates him and why we care. And like almost everything up to that point was mayhem, which is anarchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a very non-traditional approach to writing a novel that is like, because ultimately it is about characters. So it is weird that you only meet those characters like halfway through.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is like he wanted the proper setup, right? Like he wanted to make sure you really kind of like felt that. I mean, the first few chapters were like kind of building up, like this is what the Soviet Union is like, and this is how they're reacting to supernatural events, and this is why, all this stuff can happen and they can get away with it, because like no one believes in any of it. And so I think the setup was important. Like I think if this started with the master, or started with Margarita, or even started in a time like maybe you say it would start when they were together, and then they ultimately become separated, and then they end together again. That's like a traditional story, right? Like the climax, you have them being together, and then the climax would be them getting separated somehow, or like having to leave each other, like the master describes, and then ultimately they come back together. Blah blah blah. Traditional structure. I think that would have been a lot less effective.
Okay. So the way I normally describe the way this story plays itself out is it's like a spiral or a corkscrew, in a way, where it kind of starts out broad circles. Here's the setting, here's the society, here's what's happening. And then as the plot goes on, the spiral starts to narrow and the circles get smaller, and the narrative becomes more focused on certain characters. And the critiques I heard mostly is that some people said that a lot of like literally a third of this book is mayhem. Like we have the first two chapters, which do a really good job setting up, here's Soviet society, here's first century Palestine, but then right away after that, Berlioz gets decapitated, and then the entourage starts causing all kinds of mayhem, and then Ivan ends up in the psych ward, and then Nicanor Ivanovich ends up getting fake currency and then gets arrested, and then Stiopa gets teleported to Yalta, and like all this mayhem is ensuing, like basically for the next 10 chapters until we get to chapter 12, where we get the magic show, and then chapter 13, then we get an in-depth look at a character. And the critiques that I've seen are mostly like, okay, like, some of the mayhem could have been, cut back a little bit. And I think it is fair to say, too, Bulgakov did not actually edit this book and put it together. It was Elena, his wife. So maybe he wouldn't have done it that way, or maybe he would have. We just don't know. But I thought that was kind of a fair critique. I think it would have been easier if we got to the characters a little sooner. But regardless, I mean, it still made it into the top 100 best novels of the 20th century. So enough smart people liked it enough to put it there.
Yeah. I mean, I enjoy it. I think it's a fun read. Like I said, I wouldn't put too much stock into anything. Like, obviously you can discuss the stuff, but like for me, those chaotic scenes are some of the most fun in any book I've read. Like, people don't typically write that way, so.
Yeah, no, it is a fantastic supernatural satire. And honestly, it's the only supernatural satire I can really think of. Like, most people, you're right, most people don't write that way. Like, most people, like, there's plenty of people that write satire, but how many people can you think of had the idea to say, I'm going to write all this satire for this really oppressive regime, and then on top of that, I'm going to intertwine demonology into that satire, and oh, by the way, some of the demonology is actually going to be pretty spot on. Like, it's pretty impressive how he was able to do that.
Well, just yesterday, after church, I was talking to Marina, and she was telling, she grew up in the Soviet Union. She was telling me about, like, how hard they pushed atheism. Like, she was like, they basically, like, them pushing atheism was more important to them than actually, like, teaching stuff in school. Like, everything was like no God.
Wow.
Like, their literature was no God. Their math, their science, like, all this stuff was like, even their history, like, they tried to, like, basically, I don't know what you want to call it, like, whitewash all of that period, and like, and she said, it was very hard to not be an atheist. I mean, she said she was for a really long time until she had an experience, but basically, like, everyone she knew was. And it was like, not, like, you would never have the chance to think about Christianity or something because they would just never give you that chance. You'd have to, like, really, really try to be faithful or to even find that path in that system. So, I don't know what it would really be like, but I think this is an interesting portrayal of what it would be like if, like, some demons went to Moscow and in that time period. Because, like, what would they do? They probably would try to come up with every naturalistic explanation for people disappearing and reappearing in other places, and people being decapitated and then put their head back on and still being alive, and, like, people running out of theaters naked, and money transforming into other money.
Yeah, everything was rigged against the people. To compare, to just play the Soviet Union off the kingdom of Satan. The opposite of the kingdom of God, which I thought Bulgakov did a great job doing. But were there any other thoughts you had about any of the other characters, like how Hela seems to just disappear? Oh, and like how the demons' true identities are revealed.
I did think that was super interesting. Because they're so animated, they're so like extravagant during this period. But then when they like transform, they're kind of just expressionless slaves that don't have any other existence other than to follow rolling around. So like in a way, they're kind of like tortured souls.
Yeah.
Even though they're like his most, I mean, this is the way they kind of frame it, is that they're kind of like his most trusted band of acquaintances, like outside of this one specific event. They're very much just like almost like zombies. They just don't have any expression. They just are cursed to follow him around, and they don't do anything after that point. They don't say anything else. They don't have anything.
Yeah, it actually reminded me a lot of the ball when they had all the crazy animals playing instruments and everything, and then there was that fireplace in the distance that all of these tormented souls were walking out of. And like I actually thought the ball scene was really quite brilliant because it was an image of hedonism where everything is extravagant and crazy and overindulgent and everything, but yet it was also kind of disturbing and everything was just so off. And the guests were all people who have done these horrible things that they didn't repent of. And they're there and they almost have to like talk about their sins, but not in a way that is salvific or in a way that absolves them. So it's not like they're going to confession or anything, but they have to talk about their sins to the hostess just as part of the requirement. And I really, really appreciated how he was able to pull that off and make it seem like, okay, this is hilarious and extravagant and luxurious, but at the same time, though, it is hell. And I think that the true identities of the demons, of the entourage, are kind of fit within that paradigm because Koroviev is this Violet Knight who is just stoic all the time. And Azazelo is the demon of the waterless desert. So he's nothing glamorous. And then Behemoth is this depressed jester, which I also found interesting too, especially given that like, and I don't know if Bulgakov was thinking about this, but something that crossed my mind was how, you know how a lot of comedians, a lot of comics get depressed? Like a lot of them are on pills. And you think that these should be the happiest people ever. They're always so lively and funny and everything when they're on stage, but like behind the scenes, they're all on pills. And I thought that was really interesting that Behemoth turns out to be a jester who is miserable. But it would also explain too his antics and how he loves to perform and put on shows and essentially just act like a clown. I also think it's really interesting too how, like, because the approach of the demons is most of the time just to be, funny and mischievous. Like, you could say that Azazelo is a bit of a creep and Hela was just kind of like, I mean, you could say she's seductive, like that one time, but for the most part, she's kind of gross. Like when it describes her crawling through the window, like it's just talking about like her skin is rotting and everything, like she's a picture of death. But the one thing I love about the demonology here is like these demons are so mischievous and hilarious that it's like, usually people who are funny tend to be the most disarming. When someone cracks a joke and it makes you laugh and makes you like them and it's disarming. But the demons kind of do similar things. Like they can make people laugh, but they also trap people and they psychologically damage people and they torment them. So there's kind of both things going on at once. And then in the last chapter, when their true identities are revealed, we kind of get to see that. We get to see what's kind of, behind the veil underneath the mask. So I did appreciate that element of it.
Yeah. And like you mentioned with Hella, um, could just be that Margarita replaced her.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's kind of a bit of a mystery as to where she went because she was there for the ball, and then after the ball, she was gone. Like,
Mm-hmm.
they never mentioned her again.
Yeah.
Um, and who knows? Like, she could, I mean, it could partially be because she's a vampire, um, because Veranuka became a vampire.
Yeah, but he got cured though.
And he got cured. So who knows what happened with Hela?
Mm-hmm.
Like, she might just not be one of Volan's regular band. She might just have been like a supporting kind of asset for him. You know, like maybe she's a vampire that was already in Moscow, and she just came to serve him because what else would a vampire do when the devil comes to Moscow?
Like a demonic contractor.
Yeah, like ultimately she's an evil being, and the evil beings kind of serve the devil in a way, and so like he's in town, so he goes and serves him while he's there, and then maybe when he leaves, she's just continuing to be a vampire in Moscow.
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't really know. It's kind of a hard thing to say because she didn't show up when the rest of them showed up either.
Right.
Like, they materialized in Patriarch Pond. She wasn't there.
Right.
But Behemoth, Koroviev, and Azazel were there.
Yes. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, there is a lot of loose ends that he really did not tie up with this. And it might not be his fault because, I mean, he wrote this book once, burned it, then rewrote it from memory, and then Elena had to put it all together. And, I mean, who knows, maybe certain things didn't make it in. Who knows? We can't know for sure. But yeah, there's definitely some loose ends that he did not tie up.
Well, the whole book is kind of like a giant loose end in a way because, you know, the whole book, I mean, from the first chapter to the last, is kind of like Volan coming to Moscow. The first chapter is him arriving, the last chapter is him leaving.
Mm-hmm.
But we still don't really understand the reason why. We know it's to have this ball, but why does the devil need to have this ball? And why does it need to be with someone named Margarita?
Well, I think it does say, now we don't know why he needs a hostess. That is true. But I think that one of the reasons why he came to Moscow is to almost take like a temperature check to see what he could get away with. Because remember when he's standing there with Azazel before Behemoth and Koroviev get back, they're looking at the city, and Koroviev's like, yeah, it's nice, but I like Rome a lot better. Kind of hinting at like they've caused chaos in places before. So I think just the concept that they're agents of chaos, going from city to city, taking like a social climate temperature check to see what they can get away with. Because it's like, you know.
But he came there for the ball because remember they were like, we looked all over the place. Like we came here to find a Margarita. Mm-hmm. And he's like, there are like 27 of them, but only one will do.
Yeah. Well, why do you think he had to have the ball?
That's what I don't know. That's what I don't know.
I mean, it is an annual ball. What it is, one thing that is interesting is it does say it happened at the full moon in springtime, which is basically around the time of Pascha.
Yeah.
So maybe there's definitely, you know, the devil's always trying to disrupt the sacred. So I think that could be part of it.
Yeah. And I initially was thinking like with the ball, it has to revolve around a woman, and like I don't know if the name is significant, but like it almost is kind of like this marriage ritual ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that too with the shared chalice.
Yeah.
So maybe there's some kind of thing with the devil and having to complete a pact or something I don't know.
It's the old trope. Yeah, we talked about it last week, like the inverted Theotokos trope, where it's like, God comes to the Theotokos and tells her that you're going to bear my son, who's going to save the universe. So the Theotokos saying yes to God saves the world. But then there's the inverse of that, where the devil takes a bride and uses his bride to, in one way, I guess, rule the world or cover all the world in shadow or create an incarnation of darkness on the whole world. And, whoever that bride is, her saying yes to Satan condemns the world. Like that is that is an archetypal trope to a degree. I mean, but no, is that what this is? I mean, that's the only thing I could think of. But yeah, I mean, like I was saying before, I feel like if I read this book when I was like 20, I would have just been totally obsessed. I would have thought it was the coolest thing ever. And I still think it's good. I still think that it has a lot of interesting things to say. But in terms of the characters, like, in terms of like measuring them by their virtue, I mean, Margarita she's interesting because it all depends on how you look at her. You could say she's entering into this pact to restore love with the master. But on the other hand, you could also make a case that Margarita is kind of a rotten character because she's
kind of contemptible, like
yeah,
she's unfaithful to her real husband.
Yep.
But then you can also say like she is truly in love and devoted to the master.
Mm-hmm.
So she does have like love in her. It's not like.
Yeah, and I felt like some of those scenes with her and the master were a little bit too schmoozy. Like a little bit too idealistic, so to speak.
And it's interesting that, like, in a lot of those scenes, you can always tell, at least I could always tell that Margarita is, like, a lot more into the master than he is into her.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if it was meant to come off that way, but, like, she literally makes a pact with the devil just to be with him.
Yeah.
And then, like, he doesn't necessarily instantly reciprocate that.
Right.
And maybe you can make an argument that he's like trying to do it out of their best interests. Like he's like, nah, I gotta go back to the insane asylum. Like we can't be together because it'll be worse for you and stuff like that. But like, it almost seems like he doesn't try nearly as hard to be with her as she tries to be with him.
Yeah, that's true. And that's one thing, like, in chapter 13, when we get introduced to him, that's the time where we actually really get to know him, where his motives are clearly laid out. But then after that, it's like we never really get the same kind of time with him. And that's why some people say that the true protagonist of the story is actually Margarita. Because let's just say if this were like a movie and we're just taking screen time, she would have way more than the master. Like, she's doing way more stuff. Like, she's, meeting with demons, she's becoming a witch, she's flying around, she's destroying people's apartments, she's becoming the hostess for a ball. And like with the master, it's like we see him in the insane asylum, we see him get teleported out of the insane asylum, like noetically, and then we see him accompany Margarita to meet with Voland, and then in the end he frees Pilate. So in a very real way, she is the real protagonist of this story.
Yeah, we talked about this either last week or a couple weeks ago. Like, I think it's pretty clear Bulgakov was trying to make a big point about, like, true love and, like, going to hell and back for love. So I don't know if you have anything more to say about that now that we're completely done. But,
Yeah, well, it seems like his whole idea of redemption is to be absolved of one's sin by whatever means, and to not be a coward. And just to like play Bulgakov's advocate. I can kind of see how, like, obviously, like in his situation, cowardice was a huge problem because it was destroying all the art. It was destroying his society. So if we take this book subjectively from his perspective, it makes perfect sense that he would consider that the number one vice of humanity. But also, I mean, if you think about other problems that happen just because people are cowardly, like how many problems don't get resolved because somebody is just too scared to face somebody, or how many alliances are fractured and how much disunity can ensue just because people are too scared to have a conversation. You know, I think that, you know, he has some points there. And I think that, like, for him, the concept of cowardice being the culprit for a societal breakdown, I think that, you know, I wouldn't blame him. Like, I heard some critique of this book saying that, like, well, I think he's putting too much on cowardice. But it's like, when you look at his situation and the perspective that he's writing from, it makes perfect sense that he would put cowardice as the number one vice, like the worst thing that a human being can be. Because, you know, every self-obsessed person is a coward in a very real way. Because, you know, they're too scared to put someone else before themselves, or they're too scared to deny themselves.
Yeah, I would say cowardice is almost a side effect of like pride or vanity.
I think so too.
You know,
Yeah.
it's like because you know you're a coward because you're afraid of what's going to happen to you, right? So that means you value yourself very highly, which means, you know, you're suffering from something else. Like cowardice isn't the sin or the vice there. It's just a byproduct of it.
Yeah. Or causing someone, or doing what Pontius Pilate did, and throwing someone else under the bus to save his own skin. Yeah, I think Bulgakov is right to call that out. But yeah, definitely an interesting ending. Was there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap this up?
No. Good.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, we can get this recording uploaded and posted. And yeah, that is the Master and Margarita. So hopefully I can get a blessing to do another study. And if I do, I'll announce it.